evening presentation is about pruning, and especially pruning in anticipation of our monsoon season. And for those of you that haven't been through a monsoon, it can be a little scary at times, and I'm going to show some pictures here in a few minutes. And it can damage, especially trees, with the winds, the high winds that are associated with the monsoons. I am a certified arborist, and I'm also a native of Arizona. I grew up here in Central Phoenix, and I live out in the East Valley now, out in Queen Creek, for those of you that might be watching from that city or town, sorry. And I so appreciate being asked to come and present the pruning class for both the city of Chandler and the town of Queen Creek. I was hoping that I could show you meet you face to face, but we can't figure out how to work the camera portion of this program. So I apologize for that. If we figure it out before the end of the class, we'll do that. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and move right along with the class. Now, we're going to be talking about pruning, but there are also some other things associated with that, and we're going to focus on trees, but some of the same principles can apply to your shrubs as well. But for the most part, we will be covering the trees, which are the most important things in our landscape. They take the longest to mature. They're the most expensive to replace. So it's really important that we try and take care of them the best that we can. There are some class materials, and you should have received these. If not, they'll be posted, I believe, on the Chandler website. The first one is just a class summary about what we do when our trees are affected by storm damage. There's a resources list, so I'll be referring to different websites and publications throughout the presentation. Don't worry about writing them down because they're on the resources list. And if they're not, I'll tell you. There's also a handout from Dr. Ed Gilman from the University of Florida about thinning the canopies, thinning tree canopies. It's really important. So when you have time, you can take a look at that one. There's a pruning calendar, which shows you what to prune and when. Now, it has a lot of shrubs, but in the center of the handout, I think this might be on page 2 or 3, there's a section for pruning trees, the best times to prune them. The most recent ones, I sent Dina the pruning terms at the last minute, so it's not on the slide, but it will be, you may have received it, and it will be on the website. This is just kind of a cartoon. We've got to keep it lively. You can lighten it up here. 25 ways to kill a tree, and it lists them and it shows you what happened to this poor tree in the illustration. And in addition, there are brochures, and these are available from your town or city, wherever you live, even if it's not in Queen Creek or Chandler. They come to us from the Arizona Municipal Water Users and also from a company called Water Use It Wisely. The one I'm going to be referring to this evening is the one in the middle, Landscape Watering by the Numbers, because it is very important to know how to water your trees and where to place that water. So we'll go over that a little later in the presentation. And I always want to cover this at the beginning of class so that people know what an arborist is. You may have heard that term, or you may have had someone come to your home that said they were an arborist, but it's someone that has experience in the tree care field, but also they've become certified. And this is administered through the ISA, or the International Society of Arboriculture. There's an exam, a pretty grueling, a lengthy exam on tree care and identification that you have to pass. And it's given in, I believe it's 11 or 12 parts. And you have to pass each part. You can't just pass the whole exam. You have to pass each section. Along with that, there are continuing education hours that have to be earned every 3 years so that an arborist's information is as current as possible. The information I'm going to give you tonight is not just because Kathy said so. This is from there are standards for pruning, and these are available through the ISA if you're so inclined to want to, order some for yourself. You really don't need them unless you're working with a homeowner association and you have contracts that you may be awarding various landscape maintenance companies. Our Arizona monsoon season is very characteristic of our region, and it includes a seasonal shift in the winds. Now, for most of the year, our winds or breezes come from the west, the southwest, perhaps even the northwest. And with this time of year, as we begin moving into summer, the winds will shift. This generally occurs about June 15th, so we're about a month away. And instead of the winds coming from the west, they switch and start coming from the southeast. About half of our annual rainfall occurs during the monsoon season. And the warm air creates low surface pressure zones. And I'm going to show a couple examples of this in just a moment. The clouds that form are fueled by daytime heating. So I know we all hate summer, and we know it's here. It's, the intense heat that's just around the corner, but it also is what drives our monsoon season. When the storm cells collapse, that's when we get the high winds and the dust. And some of these winds can be very high, exceeding 50 miles an hour. So here's a little illustration that kind of shows you what's ahead. So starting in June, as I mentioned, the high pressure migrates north, and our typical southwesterly wind shifts to the southeast. At the same time, it drives mid-level moisture from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico into Arizona. It produces a radical change in our moisture conditions. The humidity comes in and we all feel sticky. And together with the heating during the day, it's the key to our monsoon. In fact, the Wikipedia definition of a monsoon is a seasonal reversing wind accompanied by corresponding changes in precipitation. I think we're all hoping for a good monsoon season. Last year, we just didn't have much of anything. So here is a storm cloud, a storm cell, they sometimes call them. And the warm air is lifted and then it condenses to form these cumulus type clouds. And that's the updraft stage. And as it continues, it forms these huge towering cells, it's cloud cells. The rain that begins to be produced inside the cell falls through the air, of course. And as it evaporates, it becomes cooler. And the air that's pulled downward by the precipitation creates these downdrafts. Hot air rises, cool air falls. So cool air accelerates as it reaches the ground, and then the wind curls out and spreads, away from the point of impact. When these downdrafts reach the ground level, then that air hits the ground out ahead of the storm and creates the gusts that pick up the dust, and we call them dust storms. And here, this is an actual photograph of a storm cell that hit the valley. It's been several years ago. But you can see in the center of this that the rain and that cold air is coming down with force, and you can see the dust that's being lifted up around the bottom of that cell. And if you look out your window and you see something like this coming, you know that it's time to take cover. Sometimes these dust storms can reach incredible levels in height. And along with those winds, sometimes we get some pretty bad storm damage. A little monsoon trivia I thought you might enjoy is that in our Sonoran Desert, you may have heard this in past years where you hear a buzzing outside, usually coming from the trees. And these are from insects called cicadas. And they generally start buzzing about 2 weeks before the monsoon season begins. So in a couple of weeks, if you walk outside and you begin to hear the buzzing from the cicadas, then you'll know that the monsoon season isn't too far away. And they look like this. The adult is on the right, and the exoskeleton of the larva is there, that small picture. They usually crawl out of the ground and then they attach themselves to the closest thing. It could be a building or a tree trunk, and then they emerge as adults. And as it says here, they're kind of creepy looking, but they're harmless. They buzz a lot and they fly around your porch lights at night, but they don't sting or anything. So why do trees fail? I don't know if any of you had storm damage to your trees in the past, but do you know what the reason is for that? People plant trees all the time, but sometimes they just fail to become established. And we're going to have a question here. This is your doodle question poll on why trees fail. So just pick the best answer. Is it not enough water? Too much pruning? Insects or other pests? Or not enough pruning? And we'll give you 30 seconds or a minute or so to answer the question, and we'll see where everyone's opinion lies.
Can you see the responses, Kathy?
I cannot see them.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So we had let's see, 6% said not enough water, 12% said too much pruning, and 35% said not enough pruning. The rest had no answer.
No insects?
The rest, yeah, not one person said insects.
Okay, well, that's good. All right, well, I'm not going to answer the question for you right now. We're going to go through some slides and then we'll come back to this question. We'll see if we can explain the answer, the correct answer. Okay, so here I've got some pictures of trees that have failed, and of course, here's one, here's another. This may have happened in your neighborhood or similar things. And I'm sure you wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and see this on your car. You can see where the branch broke off just beyond the bumper, the rear bumper of the car. I don't know if that's in the neighbor's yard or if that's the homeowner's yard, but that would be awful. Here's a couple more. And this is examples of wind throw, which is basically trees falling over. But I want you to pay attention, especially to the tree on the left, to the depth of the root zone. Just keep that in mind. And here's, of course, another example of some branch failure. This homeowner is probably just heartbroken that this happened to their tree. It looks like it must have been a beautiful example. And a couple more, one that where the tree kind of just blew apart from the center, and another one that toppled over. So some trees fail, but others live for years. This photo comes to us from the U of A Campus Arboretum. So what are the keys? Why do trees fail? And I'm going to skip this because we already answered, this was your question, that we already answered this earlier. So the keys are planting, staking and tying, irrigation, and pruning and maintenance. So we're going to spend just a little time on the first three bullet points before we actually get into the pruning, because you may have to replace a tree, in which case you'll need to know correct planting and staking and tying. And then irrigation is important for all of us, whether you have a mature tree or a young tree. So let's just dive right in and get to that. There's a little, saying about trees. It could be other shrubs as well, but putting the right plant in the right location. And this example, it's a mesquite tree, and some of you may have mesquites in your yard, and if so, you know how big they can get. So it's important to give them enough space to grow. And this yard looks like they've given it, ample room. However, here's an example of the right plant, another mesquite, but just in the wrong location. This is a little tiny patio area where they planted a mesquite. And that just means double trouble for both the tree and the surrounding structure. Another right plant, wrong location. This tree has a little narrow planting area between the parking curb and the fence. And the root system of this tree probably just didn't have enough area to stretch out and become strong. And when we put the wrong plant in the wrong location, or even the right plant in the wrong location, it can lead to poor care choices, like these poor trees. And even ground covers. So if you're going to be planting something, you don't need to follow the standards that were written, or not standards, but even, I guess, recommendations that were written years and years ago. They used to say you needed to dig a pit to plant a tree. That's just not the case. And we have new planting standards that were written by Dr. Jimmy Tipton, who was the man in the hole in the previous slide. And we call them new, and that's because not everyone uses them, but they've been out for a number of years. And just in summary, it basically says, especially here in the Arizona desert, you need to moisten the soil first, because you know how hard our dry soil can be. So moisten it first. Then you only need to dig a hole as deep as the container. Don't dig it 3 times as wide and 6 times as deep, or vice versa. Just as deep as the container. You'll need to loosen the soil in a big diameter around where you're going to plant. Now, you don't need to remove the soil, just loosen it. Just stick a shovel in and loosen it, and enough of an area so that the roots will be able to grow into the surrounding soil in a pretty easy manner. You put native soil back into the hole. You don't mix with amendments. So you put your native soil, use that as the backfill. If you have mulch, which nurseries always want to sell you mulch, mulch is great, but save it and use it on top of the soil. Don't mix it in. And if you're planting a tree that has its original nursery stake attached, once you get it in the hole, then you'll want to remove that original stake. It's usually lashed really tightly to the trunk, the main trunk of the tree. Once you remove the nursery stake, you may have to tie the tree, depending on how strong its trunk is. If a citrus tree, you would never need to stake and tie. but other trees may need some help. And these standards have been adopted by the ISA, the National Forestry Association, even Western Garden Book and cooperative extension offices. Those are 3 universities in just about every state. But unfortunately, they're still not used by many landscapers. So even if you're not going to plant a tree yourself, it's important to know how it should be planted. And if you're having someone do it for you, make sure they do it correctly. This little illustration just explains what we spoke about. You only need to dig the hole as deep as the container, loosen the soil in a wide area, plant your tree. Of course, dig in the center, dig a hole where you can put your tree. You may need to score the root ball, and that's recommended. You take a utility knife and just cut in maybe a ½ inch or so in 2 or 3 places longitudinally down the edge of the root ball. Plant your tree, backfill with native soil. If you need to stake it, use 2 wooden stakes and tie the tree in between. And then the layer above the dotted line there, that indicates the mulch. So you would put your layer of mulch on top of the soil. And some of you may be wondering why I said no mulch in the backfill. Because that's kind of been a standard for a lot of gardeners and landscapers, is to mix mulch in the backfill. But it's not recommended, and here's why. Your plant's roots are going to get established. We want them to get established as quickly as possible and into the native soil. If you add mulch or compost, which is indicated by the little kind of blue dots in the backfill on the left side there, that adds a different texture. You're basically creating another, gardening or landscape container or pot in the ground. And if your goal is to get the tree established as quickly as possible, you want those roots in our native soil and not in another bunch of container type soil. If you add mulch, it really doesn't shorten the establishment time. Sometimes you may see some rapid foliage growth, but it doesn't help the tree get established any quicker. And because compost or mulch decomposes so rapidly here in our desert soils, the tree can sink and the soil can sink around the tree. So don't mix it in with the native soil. Save it as a layer on top. That will help keep the soil cool. It will, as it decomposes, it slowly releases nutrients back into the soil. So that's, and frankly, it's a little easier. You don't have to worry about mixing stuff. And it's important not to plant a tree too deeply, or any plant for that matter, too deeply. In this example, if you can see near the top of the photograph where the kind of green bark of the Palo Verde changes to brown. And then you see the little, I think that's a Leatherman knife laying on the side of the trunk to indicate size. And then farther down toward the bottom of this photo, you'll see what they call the root crown, where the roots emerge from the trunk of the tree. That brown area indicates how deep this tree was planted. In a tree or any other plant, the trunk tissue or stem tissue on a shrub must remain exposed to the air until you reach the root crown, where the trunk tissue turns into the root tissue. So right about where that kind of skinny little root is crossing over the top of our tree trunk here, that's about where you would want the soil level to be. In this case, this tree was probably planted 10 or 12 inches too deep. And what that does is it actually suffocates the tree. The bark or the trunk tissue needs to be exposed to air or the plant can suffocate. And here's a couple more examples. Here's one that was planted about 7 inches too deep or below the level of the surrounding soil. And you can see the trunk flare or the root flare where the trunk tissue turns into root tissue or roots right there by the tape measure. And another one, this was a little less. This was about 3 or 4 inches too deep. And this is really sad because it doesn't cause immediate death of a plant. The plant struggles. It will show maybe a branch here or there that wilts and dies, and a few months later, another part of it will die, and eventually the whole tree will probably die. But if you find that this is the case with any of your trees, you can actually gently excavate that soil until you reach the root crown, and then leave that trunk tissue exposed to air. Now, staking and tying. This is an example of a young tree that was planted in a landscape. This was a commercial landscape, and they staked it, they tied it. And here's a close-up of the tie. They used a piece of hose with a wire in between, and the little trunk of the tree is it's loose inside that hose so that it has an area to move just slightly in the wind. And this is what you want. The trunk should be able to move just a little bit within the ties. So they actually did a pretty good job when they tied this tree. Now this image, I'm going to go back up one. There we go to the previous picture. Do any of you notice anything maybe different or unusual about this little tree? You don't have to answer it unless you want to on the Q&A, but this is just kind of food for thought. Does it look different than many young trees you may have seen planted? And I've asked this question in other classes, and most people say, yeah, it looks like, they should have taken those bottom branches off. This sort of trees, when they're in a nursery setting and they're close to each other, the one can or one, container is touching another container, they're kind of protected by, each other. But once you take a plant and you put it out in the middle of a sea of granite, it's out on its own and it's exposed to the elements. And these lower branches, even though they might look funny and it's not your mental picture of a tree, this is what you should do, is allow those lower branches to remain, because they're going to shade the trunk of this little tree and prevent sunburn. Believe it or not, trees can sunburn. Their bark can be very tender, especially with young trees. So this is okay. This is okay for the first year. And then you can begin lifting those branches up so that it looks more like, our image of a tree, a mature tree. The other thing that I want to ask you is about all these green parts, the leaves. Is it better to have a lot of leaves on a tree or not? I'll go back to the other picture. Each leaf is a little food factory for the tree. And with young trees especially, you want this tree to get established, you want its roots to grow, you want its branches to grow. So each leaf is producing energy for this tree to use to grow. So the more leaves you leave on a tree, the better fed, I guess you could use that word, its energy reserves are going to be replenished much, much faster. So again, by leaving those lower branches on, this little tree is going to have the best chance to really get a good start. As opposed to this poor tree it was staked and tied, and they didn't use the round wooden post, they used a metal T-post. And then they tied it and they went off and just, forgot about it. So now it's actually impaled on the top of the T-post. So if you stake and tie your trees, be sure you check those ties every few months, because you don't want it to become a tourniquet for this little trunk. And this is a pretty good example of staking, of what not to do for staking and tying. I counted, I think there's like 6 or 7 stakes on this tree, and it's lashed, and it probably had some storm damage. Maybe it blew over a little bit, and they've staked it, but it's kind of overkill. And what about pruning a young tree or a new tree at planting time?
Excuse me, Kathy, before you move on.
Yeah.
Quick question. Well, so we know that it's best to use something soft like a hose as a tie for the
Yes.
stake. Also, how high should those stakes go? Where is a good spot to actually tie them off?
Well, let me
Stake
go
them
back
off.
to that. Let me go back to that previous slide. There we go. Okay, so this little tree, frankly, if it were my tree, I probably would have tied it up just a little higher. A really easy way to figure out where to put the tie is to just hold on to the trunk, and if the top of the trunk kind of like top of the tree kind of flops in one direction or another, then you probably need to move the tie up a little higher. Or in this case, there could have been 2 ties on this tree. But it's kind of long and lean. It's kind of, looks kind of like an out of control teenager here. But this is the way the young tree, should look. But yeah, I think moving that tie up maybe another foot would have been better for the tree, and the top wouldn't have been so prone to perhaps, be blown around in the winds. But that's a really good question. So that's my best guess, is to grab the little trunk gently and just kind of hold, move your hand up and down on the trunk until you reach a spot where the top of the tree is not going to like fall over or, flop over.
Okay, and one other real quick question. Whenever a tree is planted and the root flare is exposed, and I think this person is asking, it says sometimes it shoots up new roots. I think that's referring to the suckers. Are those supposed to be cut off?
Yes, the roots should be covered with soil, but only, like a ½ inch of soil. Now, sometimes if a root gets damaged, the tree's response is to produce a shoot that comes up from the root. And some trees are more prone to it than others. Oaks are kind of picky about it if their roots get damaged. Like if a tree is growing in a grass area and the lawnmower nicks the top of a root, then sometimes the tree's response is to produce a little shoot. And the only way you can control it is to, prune them off.
Thank you.
Because you can't really apply any herbicide, because that will be absorbed by the whole tree. Is that good? Okay, I'm going to move on.
That's good, Kathy. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so pruning at planting. And the answer is, as you probably suspected, you really don't need to prune a newly planted tree unless it has broken branches, if there's a structural defect, which we'll cover a little bit later, but such as crossing branches or narrow angles of attachment, where the branch angles are very narrow. And in fact, a tree is going to, grow and establish a lot more quickly if you minimize any pruning. So the only ones that you should be really worried about are any, dead, dying, damaged limbs, the crossing limbs, and as I mentioned, the structural defects. And we're going to cover those. What about fertilizer? Should you fertilize a newly planted tree? I know the nurseries always want to push their fertilizer products. And the answer is, it's really not necessary. Think about the volume, the soil volume that you're working with, and that's where the roots are. There's not very much there, and it's pretty small. So you don't really need to add any fertilizer at planting time. Later on, 6 months later, then if you want to give them a light application, that's perfectly fine. Okay, just a little bit on plant biology. time limit here. Okay, I think we're good. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we have to think about the function of different plant parts. I know you didn't wake up this morning thinking you were going to be talking about plant parts, but what do branches do for a plant, a tree especially? I know you know the answers. First of all, they hold the leaves, right? We saw that young tree a few slides back. Yeah, they support all the leaves. And those leaves are making, through photosynthesis, those leaves are making energy for the tree. And they actually make sugars. They transport the sugars, or the sugars are transported from the leaves down through the tissues of the stems and the branches and the trunk down to the roots. So there's a transport of nutrients going on here in the branches. What about the roots? Of course, they hold the plant in the ground. And they absorb water and nutrients. Now the roots absorb nutrients from the soil, and those are also transported up through the tissues in the plant or the tree. And then the last thing, which is sometimes hard to a concept to grasp, is that the roots can store water and the sugars. Those sugars that the leaves are making are stored in the roots. And some roots store a lot of water. We have to supplement the water in our urban landscapes. We just don't have enough rainfall to support all the plants that we have. So we do have some native plants though that seem to get along pretty well without us, messing with them. And here's one. This is an ironwood, and they're just starting to bloom right now. Usually about the first week in May, they start to bloom. They have these beautiful sweet pea shaped flowers, and they range from light pink to pale lavender. And if you look at this tree, when a rain event happens, the water is sort of directed over the canopy and it falls to the ground at the edge of the branches. And there's a name for that area. Some of you probably know it. So the water drips off the edge of the branches and lands on the ground. This is called the drip line. The drip line, right at the edge of the branches. Now in a tree like this, over 90% of the roots that absorb water and nutrients are at or beyond the drip line. But think about where we put our emitters in our landscapes. Yeah, they're usually right next to the trunk. And no one ever told you that you should move those emitters out to the edge of the branches, but that's exactly what you should do. And it should be a gradual process this time of year. In the winter, you could probably do it all at once, but in the summertime, we want to do kind of a gradual change to our irrigation so that you'll be watering away from the trunk. Now, the other thing that this photo is a great illustration of is the strength of the tree in the ground. So when we water close to the trunk, would you say that ground is stable or unstable? Think about wet soil. Is that stable or unstable? Yeah, it's pretty unstable. I mean, if a wind comes up and you're watering right next to the trunk of a tree, that soil is not going to hold the tree in the ground very well if it's wet. So by moving the water source away from the trunk out to the edge of the branches, that soil next to the trunk dries out, and that's okay because you've got the roots now out towards the edge of the drip line. That drier soil is more stable and it's going to hold the tree in the ground during the winds. Now, as I said before, if you're going to move your emitters or the water source out away from the trunk, you need to do it gradually over the period of maybe, a month or so. And don't make an abrupt change this time of year. Old gardening resources used to say that the root system of a tree was the mirror image of the above ground canopy, kind of like this illustration. And we know now that that's just totally false. Here's what the root system of a tree really looks like. It's fairly shallow, but it extends out way beyond the drip line in most cases. Think about those trees that were blown over at the beginning of the presentation. Remember I said take a note of how deep the root system is? Yeah, they weren't very deep, were they? So about 2 feet, maybe 3 feet under the very center of the tree, but most of the feeder roots are going to be located in the top 12 inches of the soil. The deeper you go in the soil, the less oxygen there is. So most roots don't grow very deep in the soil. They stay up, as I say, in the top 12 inches for the feeder roots. There are anchoring roots that go down, 3, maybe 4 feet, but most roots are in the very top of the soil profile. So where do we want to water? I mentioned at the edge of the canopy, right? And if you move your emitters, you may have to add more, because putting one emitter at the edge of a mature tree's canopy leaves the rest of the area dry. So you may have to add more emitters. And doing that to a drip system is a pretty easy thing to do if you want to do it yourself. This illustration comes from Landscape Watering by the Numbers. And it just shows you, for a small plant, 1 emitter is fine. For a larger shrub, you might need 2, and for a tree, you're going to need several. This is also a table that comes out of Landscape Watering by the Numbers. It's on page 9. I know that because I have my little cheat number in the bottom left-hand corner there. And it tells you, depending on a plant's size, the canopy diameter, so the branches, or in case of the shrub stems, how wide those stems are, how much water it needs. So let's just pick out a tree with a 10-foot canopy. So at the top, along the top, that's the diameter, so 10 foot, and then the tree is the first row. So a 10-foot tree needs almost 60 gallons of water each time you apply it. 60 gallons. Now, how often you apply it is going to depend on the kind of tree you have and the season. Obviously, in the wintertime, you don't have to apply as often. In the summertime, you need it more frequently. And the same is true for shrubs and ground covers. So how frequently, you ask? This is also from Landscape Watering by the Numbers, and it shows you how often to water depending on the season and the type of plant you have. So the first, we're kind of talking about trees tonight. The first row is trees. So we have desert adapted or high water use. Desert adapted are going to be your mesquites, your palo verdes, your acacias, even things like evergreen elms, Chinese pistache, sisu. Those are desert adapted. And how often you want to water is also in the columns. So right now we're in, we're in May, the May transition from March to May or May to October. I think let's go to May to October. It's warming up fairly quickly. So you'll want to water once every 7 to 21 days. There's a wide range, because an evergreen elm might need water once a week. A palo verde can probably go every 3 weeks. Okay, now we're going to move on to some pruning techniques to help you prevent storm damage. And if there's any questions on the previous sections, you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end of the presentation. I show it about 12 minutes to 7, and I think I might go over just a little bit on this first section here, but see how fast we can get through this. Okay, so why do you want to prune? You signed up to take this pruning class, and I just sometimes I have to ask you, why do you want to prune? And here's some answers that may surprise you. Maybe it's because your neighbor pruned last weekend, so it kind of reminded you, oh yeah, maybe I should prune my plants or my trees. Or maybe you've seen the landscapers at work in your HOA common areas, and that's your reminder. Or maybe you've seen ads, so you get them in the mail sometimes, that promote pre-thinning before monsoons. Or maybe you just went to the home improvement store and you bought a new power trimmer and you can't wait to try it out. I hope you have smiles on your faces, because we got to keep it light. There are legitimate reasons to prune, and these include what we call the deadly Ds, the dead, broken, dying, diseased branches, weak attachments, and we'll look at a few of these, or if a tree is interfering with structures. That's a legitimate reason to prune, because you don't want to have damage to your home or your roofing tile or anything like that. It might also be for the health of the tree. If you have suckers, which generally arise from the ground. We had a question earlier about suckers that come from the bottom or near the base of the tree. Or water sprouts. Those usually form on the branches or at a pruning site. Or if you have parallel or crossing branches. Again, these are legitimate reasons. Or it might be for aesthetics, to improve the proportion or the symmetry of the tree. These are the references that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, so I'm just going to skip through these because they're available through the ISA if you so desire to get one for yourself. So hazards. This includes things like, blocking a stop sign. Yeah, that's seems kind of logical, right? Got to take care of that. Or even utility lines. They're in the way of the lines, and the power company comes through and clears the lines so that we don't have any interference from the trees. And for the health. So crossing branches, the photo on the left shows 2 crossing branches. We don't know where they tie into the main part of the tree, but one of these should be removed. Looks like the top one would be the best example. And then water sprouts, as I mentioned, these grow from sometimes pruning cuts that are made incorrectly. Water sprouts form oftentimes when trees are pruned too heavily. Sunburn, this is also a health issue, and there may need to be some pruning done in this case. When trees get sunburned, especially citrus, they're so vulnerable, then we have issues with pests that they're secondary. They move into the damaged tissue. We do have one insect that is attracted to stressed or dying tissue. And this is the adult. It's a little beetle. And they have kind of a metallic luster to them. This is the larva, and they have a very uniquely shaped head. These are borers. This is a borer. It's a flat-headed borer. You can see how he got his name, flat-headed borer. They create these galleries or tunnels just under the bark of the tree. So you may not even notice that they're there. But what you will see are the exit holes. So this is the hole where the emerging adult left the tree. This is not how the larva tunneled into the tree. This is how the adult left the tree. And these do not affect living tissue, healthy tissue. They are drawn to stressed or damaged parts of the tree, whether it's from sunburn or could be from water stress or wind damage, these you might have the flat-headed borer. They're very distinct. The exit hole is not completely round. It's oval. When it comes to structure, a branch union that has this U shape is usually very strong. This is in contrast to a branch union that has a V shape. These are typically weak, and these are the ones that get affected during our winds, our stormy winds. We have 2 young trees here in each of these pictures. The one on the left has a poor form. The one on the right has a fairly good form. The one on the left has what they call codominant branches or codominant leaders. If you look about 2 or 3 feet above the ground, you'll see the 2, if you were stems, from the tree. It looks like it has 2 trunks, and that's a very narrow angle of attachment. That is something that is poorly anchored, and it generally is vulnerable to wind damage. So one dominant trunk, these are principles of strong structure, one dominant trunk, strong branch unions, not ones that shape like a V, more like a U, and the balanced canopy. A strong connection, again, that U shape. There are there are 2 important parts of a branch union to look for. One is the branch collar, and I have more information on this, not just from this one slide. And one is the branch bark ridge. So a narrow branch union has what they call included bark. It has a weak attachment. The included bark, it's not tissue, it's not wood to wood tissue, it's bark to bark. It's not connected, it's not securely connected with included bark. And here's an example, and you can see this one is splitting, and eventually this is just going to fall right apart. Here's another one, and they all kind of look the same when in a cross section, because water and pathogens can enter through the top of this included bark structure, and then it creates this sort of staining effect. Here's a cross section of a fairly large tree, and you can see where it had 2 branches, almost the same size, that originated very narrow attachment. It's wood, it's not wood to wood, it's bark to bark, and that's why you can see that little crease down the middle. They're very weakly attached. And that's what happened with this tree. Those codominant stems or codominant branches or trunks, they often fail during storms. And that's what happened with this tree as well. It had that included bark, the narrow unions, included bark, weak attachment, and then it failed. For aesthetics, if you're trying to help improve the balance or the symmetry of a tree, you may have to put your tree on a 2 or 5 year program, because you can't do too much pruning all at once. So with this little tree, this is an obvious choice to remove that lower branch. And then there might be a few others on that left-hand side that you could shorten or remove back to the main trunk completely. And eventually, this tree will grow more branches on the right-hand side, but as you keep pruning on the left hand, its symmetry and its balance will come back. And here's some more about those structures. So we have on this illustration on the right-hand side, you have the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. The branch bark ridge is in the top, and this is where it's a branch union, and this is a U shape, and it's where bark is actually kind of pushed up in the center of that union. It kind of makes a little ridge. On the lower side of the branch, we have a branch collar, And it's kind of like a shoulder area. It's not always as apparent as it is in this illustration, but the dotted line indicates where you want to make the cut. And here's another one. So we have an example of a branch, nice union, a nice U shape to it. You don't want to cut too close because then you remove the tissue that's going to heal the pruning cut. There's a very narrow zone of, it's called cambium or meristem, where tissue is generated that closes the wound. If you cut too far out, it's gone, it's not there, and you leave a stub. If you cut too close to the trunk, then you cut it away, basically, and the wound doesn't heal. For large limbs, you're going to want to make a 3-point cut. And using a saw, you make 3 separate cuts, and I'll show you how this is done in just a moment. And when you're done, you don't use any sealants. Don't use pruning paint. Don't use that black tar stuff. Don't use the spray-on stuff. If you've made your cut in the right location, the tree will heal itself. So on the left-hand side of this illustration, this is the 3-point cut. You'll see number 1 is an undercut, and you cut about 1/3 to halfway through from the bottom, from the underside of the branch. Then you make an overcut outside where you just made that undercut, and you cut completely through the branch. What happens by doing this is you reduce the risk of tearing bark that can go clear down the side of the tree. The undercut stops that tearing. When you make your overcut, that lightens the weight. And then you come back and you make your final cut in between the branch bark ridge and the branch collar. On the right-hand side shows you where not to cut, which we kind of already covered. Now, this is a little tree that is actually outside the back door of the City of Chandler building here, where the water conservation folks are located. And when I worked here, they planted this little tree. It's an evergreen elm, and it was a nice little tree. And but it had a very narrow branch union, and I did not get a before picture, which I should have, but I drew it in just in case. There we go. So that's kind of what it looked like. It had 2 almost codominant stems and a very narrow branch union. So I waited for the landscape guys to come and take care of it, and then I waited a little bit longer and a little bit longer, and finally I brought my pruning saw from home and I cut it off because I used to work here. It's not like I invaded property. I used to work here. So I cut that, one of those codominant stems off, and it left a small wound, which, as you can see in this picture, is healing. And I just looked at it tonight when I came into the building. It's completely sealed over. You can't even really tell where that branch was. But it got rid of a big problem because those codominant branches with included bark are prone to failure. So now this tree should have a nice, long, and happy life. Oh, there's another picture of it. Yeah, so you can see it's almost healed completely. When you make a cut too close, it ends up being what they call a flush cut, and you have this sort of elliptical shaped wound. It's not round, it's elliptical. And this tree on the left, it's valiantly trying to close the wound. That big callus is forming to try and close over that wound, but it generally takes a long, long time. And these flush cuts, we get water sprouts when the flush cuts are made. It's the tree's response. It's trying to grow. It's trying to replace what was lost, and those water sprouts are not very deeply attached. They arise from just under the epidermis of the tree, and so when they get larger, then they break. If you've made a cut with a round callus, it's generally a good cut. And again, this tree will continue to heal this wound, and eventually you'll never even notice that it was You can remove old stubs if you have them, or if you have some storm damage where maybe the branch broke and you want to cut the stub off. All you do is just cut it in the right location. The tree will heal that wound, and you'll be good to go. So when should you prune? There's better times than others. Of course, if you have storm damage, you may not be able to follow this rule. But if you have deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves in the winter, it's best to prune them when they're dormant. With our desert trees, if you can prune in early May, that's great because they have a chance to heal before the really brutal heat of summer is on. But with storm damage, if you've got to prune, and clean up the wounds, then that's just, you'll have to, exceed this rule, but that's fine. Okay, here we go. So this is a tree that was in an HOA area, and I took this picture, and I want you to kind of concentrate right in the center of the photo where the branch is about a 2-foot long branch, and it's kind of heading, down towards the ground at a slight angle. If this was your tree and you wanted to remove that branch, where is the best place to cut? And I'll give you just a moment to think about that. Based on what we just talked about and the location to make pruning cuts. Okay, if you said to take it off back where this branch joins the larger branch that's kind of heading up towards the top of the photo, then you would be correct. And if you look closely, you can almost see the branch bark ridge and the branch collar on that branch. Now, this is an HOA common area, so this tree gets abused, a lot, and you can see the result of that with all these other wild pruning cuts. But on the branch that we're looking at, can you tell how many cuts were made trying to get rid of the problem? Maybe this branch was hanging over the sidewalk, or it was an issue in any case. And I think there's 6 or 7 cuts that were made to that branch to get rid of it, when really all they needed to do was make that one cut where that branch intersects with the other main branch going up. That would have solved the problem. So if that was your answer, you need to pat yourself on the back because that was correct. And you learned more about pruning here in an hour than many, many landscapers know. There's also a standard on palm trees. The one on the photo on the left is not the standard. The photo on the right is the standard. So about, horizontal, because these are green leaves, and green leaves are making food for the tree. So if you remove too many, you're basically starving. To help prevent storm damage with young trees, you need to set some objectives. Decide if it's going to be, you put your tree on a 2 or 3 or 4 year schedule. We call it a pruning cycle and a pruning dose. And there's more about this on the next slide. But whatever you decide to do, make good cuts, look at the structural issues, and if there are any present, that should be something to take care of first. Decide whether a branch is going to be temporary or permanent. As trees grow, the lower branches get removed, but you don't need to remove them all at once. If you can, I know it's a hard concept, if you can avoid pruning those lower branches for as long as possible, then those leaves will help the tree grow, it'll supply energy, and then you can remove them as time goes by. So in general terms, if you're going to prune only every 3 to 5 years, then you'll have to remove more each time. If you prune every 1 or 2 years, you don't have to remove as much each time. And the suggested program would be at planting for those defects that we mentioned, the dead, disease, dying, at years 2 or 3, 5 to 6, year 10, year 15. You don't have to have trees pruned every single year if it's done correctly. And depending on the kind of tree you have, you can remove a given amount. So on the left-hand side, the low pruning dose, this would be for mature or recently planted trees. So mature trees don't need as much taken off. And same with recently planted trees. In cooler climates, they should be on the lower dose. We don't have to worry about that here. And if you have decay-prone species, they need to be on a lower pruning dose. So the percentage is the amount of living tissue, not dead branches, living tissue, leaves and branches. The higher pruning dose on the right-hand side, so 20% or more, could be with young established trees, now not recently planted, young established trees, warm climates, that's us, and trees that are what they call good compartmentalizers. In other words, they can isolate the damage from a pruning cut and seal it off. Each time you make a cut, the tree responds by sealing off that damage and then eventually creating that callus on the outside. Now the maximum is 25%. So be sure to keep that in mind. Mature trees are a little harder to maintain, to prune, because they might have things that have been let go for years, like the hooded bark. They might have cracks in branches, or they might not be completely balanced. They could be leaning, and then of course root decay, which you can't see, that also could be an issue. So they're a little bit harder to correct. Here's another included bark. I can't say enough about this. And a cross section shows that even though these stems or trunks or could be branches, even though they're so close together, they are not. It's not wood to wood contact. The bark is there, and so the wood does not mesh. Cracks could indicate weakness. It could also be from storm damage. It could be a branch that's grown way too long out away from the tree, and it's gotten too heavy on the end, perhaps. But that's something that needs to be taken care of. This is a tree. It's in a public setting. This was a park, I believe, and see the long branch off to the left. This is something that they decided to take care of. They probably waited a little too late, but at least they recognize this could be an issue because of the excessive weight at the end of this branch. So they would, they had several options. They could have shortened that branch, or they could have removed it entirely, and they chose to take the whole branch off. And I don't know the reason, but it was their decision, and we could live with that. It did leave a large pruning cut, but now the tree is much more balanced, and there's no risk of that branch breaking and perhaps damaging a vehicle or someone under the tree, walking under the tree. There are several cases, I guess you might say, of what we call pruning malpractice. And this refers to the 2/3 rule, the lion tailing, and topping. This is an HOA common area, and these are sisu trees. They look pretty nice, but they got pruned, and now they look like this. This is violating the 2/3 rule, which says you should have 1/3 trunk and 2/3 canopy. This is about 25% canopy and 75% trunk. And this is an illustration. So in this little tree, we've got a 1/3 trunk, 2/3 canopy. That's the 2/3 rule. You don't want to prune beyond that. And this is rampant when trees get stripped of their interior foliage. Here we have a nice looking Palo Verde tree. And this one got stripped of everything except these 2 branches. All the weight is at the end. And so when a high wind came up, they broke. And then they removed the tree. So this is an example of lion's tailing, where they strip all the interior foliage, leaving leaves at the ends, at the tips of the branches. It redistributes the weight, and makes them heavy where they're vulnerable to wind damage. And there's more. Here's another tree that was lion-tailed, and they really removed the foliage on this one. And this also makes a tree vulnerable to sunburn. So when a tree is stripped of its interior foliage, it responds by trying to replace what was lost. So the growth is at the tips of the branches. Lion-tailing means poor wind resistance. And instead of stripping the interior, thinning the tips of the branches is a better alternative. To the untrained eye, this tree might look okay, but really what's happened here, again, they've stripped the interior foliage. You've got weight at the end of the branches. In response, the tree is going to put more foliage at the ends. There's not as much shade underneath, which means this tree probably will need more water. There could be sunburn, which can attract pests. Remember those pests that are attracted to damaged tissue? Yeah, that's sunburn. There's poor wind resistance, and because it's been stripped on the interior, it's going to probably respond by producing water sprouts on those branches. So this is not proper pruning. It takes a little while to train your eye to recognize this. And here's what happens when you remove too much tissue. The tree has to use its energy to defend a pest invasion, for example. So by doing that, and also by trying to replace the foliage that was lost, it uses its energy reserves. It can cause cracks. It can cause the sprouting, the water sprouts. It can, the branches can die. The whole tree can die. And there's reduced energy storage, of course. This time of year, in getting preparation for monsoon season, this is the formula for monsoon pruning. You want to do 10 to 15% thinning and 10 to 15% size and end weight reduction. That's at the ends of the branches. So no stripping on the interior, just perhaps a little thinning. Here's an illustration. So on the inside, now this one says 20%, regardless whether your tree is a single trunk or a multi-trunk, limit your pruning on the inside and do most of your pruning in the exterior where it says 80% pruning. And this tree, this is, of course, it doesn't have its leaves right now, which makes it great. We can see the branches. If you practice crown reduction, where you start at the ends of the branches and work your way in. So you follow a branch in to where it connects to another branch, and you can remove it at that point. So again, you work on the exterior of the canopy instead of the interior. And another example. So before, they worked on the exterior of this illustration, and then afterwards you get a branch that's not as long, but it's stronger because you've removed some of the exterior weight and brought it back to a stronger interior branch. And of course, the T word, this is like almost a slang word in tree care, is topping. This was a Palo Verde tree, believe it or not. Topping, that's when you just cut a branch off, not at a branch union. And what happens is the tree sprouts new shoots at the point where the cut was made that can increase the weight. So instead of removing one branch, now you've got 10 or 8 or whatever to worry about. And these are some trees that were topped. There's no meristem when you make a topping cut, so that wound can never heal, and it oftentimes becomes disease. And you can see in this cross section where the whole interior of that branch is it's got some rot going on. Now this tree has been pruned, but you have to look really closely to find the pruning cuts. So its natural form is preserved. the crown is balanced, and it has filtered shade so that this tree's water needs aren't increased dramatically. There's down near the bottom of the picture, there's a pruning cut on one of the main branches, and then up a little on the right-hand side, up if you follow that branch that kind of heads up that way, there's a couple of pruning cuts. So you can see it has been pruned. There might be a time to hire a professional if you're working near utility lines, or if you've got a hazard that you're not really sure about. If you have a tree that's really valuable to you, if you've had storm damage, or if the work is high above the ground. Don't attempt that yourself. Hire a professional. The reference list that we gave you has lots of links to written materials, and it has websites that should be able to help you. The City of Chandler has some great landscape tips on its water conservation website, and you're more than welcome to take a look at those and see what they, if that can help you in any way. And I want to thank you for joining us. If you have questions, now's the time to ask. We have a few minutes left before our time is totally out. So please let us know what you have any questions. And I think Connie and Dina are going to help field those questions.
Yep, I've got a question for you. Here's one from Russell. It says, we have a lemon tree that's leaning. It is 3 to 4 years planted, but still small. Should we stake it and try to straighten it out?
I don't think you need to stake it. If it's leaning, the only thing I would worry if it's going to lean more. Maybe it's leaning because the soil subsided a little bit on one side. If it's a young tree, I would just leave it because it's going to grow up. It's going to grow straight up. The trunk that's leaning won't change, but any more growth in the top of the tree is going to be straight. So I think you're okay by not staking it, unless you feel like it's going to lean more, and then you could put, a stake to help prevent it from leaning anymore.
Thank you. And then we have another one from Blake. It says, and you may have talked about this, I was busy typing and I kind of missed this part, but it says,
Okay.
how can you identify the codominant trunks on native trees that are naturally multi-trunked?
Oh, well, it's the branch union angle. So even though, if you have a multi-trunk tree, even though it's, I'm trying to explain this. As long as that branch union looks more like a U than a V, you're safe. But I know I planted a young desert willow last year, and this winter I took off a couple of the lower branches, even though I kind of wanted it to be a multi-trunk. It's just they were growing so close to the main trunk, they had a very narrow angle. I just went ahead and took them off, for safety reasons. So just look for that branch union angle. And if it looks like a U, you're okay. If it's more narrow, then you might want to think about removing that branch.
Okay, thank you. And then Ginny Lee asks, I'd like suggestions or guidance for pruning my pink trumpet vine to get an abundance of flowers.
Oh, well, that's a good one. And I don't know how old your vine is. I had a pink trumpet vine too, the Podrania. I think it's Podrania ricosoliana, and the best time to prune them is going to be in the winter, or when they have the least amount of leaves. I don't know that I'd try and prune it now, but they generally only bloom in the spring, and then they have a little bit of rebloom in the fall. So if you're past your spring bloom, it may be just kind of, cycling down for summer, and then it'll kick back up in the fall. If that's not the answer to the question that, send us another question if I didn't answer that completely, but you might, to spur flower growth, you don't want to give it too much fertilizer or too much nitrogen. You can give it fertilizer, but watch your nitrogen, because nitrogen promotes leaves and something that's a little higher maybe in phosphorus was going to give you more flowers. That might help too.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another one from Maria. It says, sometimes people pollard their mulberries.
Oh, yeah.
Are all the new branches, wait, hold on. Are all the, with all the new branches, let me see. Will all the new branches have weak attachments? There we go.
Generally, yes. It used to be real common practice for all the mulberries to get, pruned, and they would, chop them back every, fall or winter. And then in the spring, of course, they grow back. They produce new shoots that are long, these long whipped shoots. It's not really pollarding. They do that in Europe a lot. Here, it's really bad pruning, but I know what you mean. And then the tree over time develops big knuckles. And mulberries are very vulnerable to developing city canker, which is a fungal pathogen. So because they get pruned like that so badly. So there's no way to restore the mulberry to a natural form after it's been pruned like that. But you could select one at each knuckle. You could select one or two branch of those long branches and let those grow and see how it does, rather than having, sometimes they'll develop, a dozen or so at that point. So you could select just a few to take the growth from the tree. I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you. And then Trisha asks, when is it time, and this is, I'm sure is tough, when is it time to call it quits with a tree? She has an Arizona, it's tough. She has an Arizona ash that has been riddled by borers.
Oh, yeah.
The bark is sloughing off and the borer holes are visible. The major limbs have dieback.
Yes. Ash trees are big, big water hogs, and they do really well in flood irrigated areas, but in our normal sort of, granite desert landscapes, or even in a lawn area, they just don't get the water that they really need. A lawn area by sprinklers, I'm talking about. And the fact that yours has insect damage, and I'm guessing that you have holes that are about thumb size in diameter. There's an insect that targets, I know I talked about the flat-headed borer that targets dead tissue. There is one that targets live tissue, and it's called the carpenter worm moth. And it creates a large larva from the carpenter worm moth. Carpenter worm, I think it's a leopard moth and the carpenter worm. Same thing, but the carpenter worm is the larva and the leopard moth is the adult. Anyway, the exit holes are about as big as your thumb. And if that's the case in your tree, and you've got flagging where you've got limb dieback, and maybe you've even lost some limbs, I would think seriously about just taking the tree out, and you may need to burn the wood that is left. Once you peel the bark off, you can probably see the tunneling under the bark, and it may be way more extensive than you think. Because the carpenter worm, as I say, they live on live tissue, and they seem to be attracted mostly to chamois ash. Not so much Arizona ash, but especially chamois ash. So yeah, that's a tough one. And if you will send Connie or Dina your email address, they may already have it. I have some information on the carpenter worm that I can email you back, or I can send it to Dina and she can get it to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kathy. I think that's the end of our questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know if Dina's going to come back or not, but I so appreciate you sticking with us here for the duration of the class, and hopefully you picked up some tips. There will be a PDF of the presentation on the Chandler website, and of course you've got all the reference materials and the handouts that can help you with any questions or problems you have with the storm damage